Representative Stuck.
Here.
Senator Tiffany. Nancy Dressel.
Here.
Stephen Dykstra.
Here.
Donna Heitmenick.
Here.
Ann Malone.
Here.
Brenda Warren.
Here.
Michael Weber.
Thank you, and I understand that Representative Rohrcast and Senator Tiffany are at another Ledge Council Study Committee on Direct Primary Care, so they will not be joining us. I think staff is representing Senator Tiffany here today. We have the approval of minutes from the August 29th, 2018 meeting. Do we have a motion? Have you all had a chance to review those? Mm-hmm. And do we have a motion to approve?
I approve the minutes.
Donna Heitmenick. Second from Stephen Dykstra. And I guess we can have a unanimous motion to accept those. So if there are no oppositions, we will consider those accepted.
Hearing none. Hearing none.
Hearing none, the meeting or the minutes are approved.
Thank you.
Thank you for that technicality. This morning and today, we have a full, not a full agenda of invited speakers, but I think we're going to have some vigorous debate, dialogue, and interaction. And in the past, I haven't run this meeting like a standing committee where the chair would need to be recognized in between individual questions. And I don't know that that will be necessary, but because of the nature of what we're going to be discussing and some of the dicey topics, I do want to reserve that right to have you always come back to the chair. But the way we're going to lay it out, just kind of an agenda this morning, is we're going to hear first from Dr. Colleen Pinnell, who is from Carroll University, an assistant professor of literacy and elementary reading, and then we'll have at 11 o'clock Kathy Champeau, Deb Zarling, and possibly someone else from the WSRA come and present for 10 or 15 minutes. And then prior to breaking for lunch, it's my intention to have each of us go around and have possibly up to 5 minutes to discuss what it is that we want to, what the top agenda items are for you as a committee member, to anticipate and kind of prime the pump, if you will, for discussion after the lunch break. So if you had all gotten the paper from Ledge Council with the different ideas on, there may be other ideas that come up, but if you would kind of put those in a hierarchy, the idea of this meeting is to come out with drafting instructions for Ledge Council as to how to move this to the actual legislative process in the next session. So that is all of the preamble and preliminary that I have. Senator Schottner, as Vice Chair, do you have anything that you want to add to that before we call up the speaker?
Well, I just think that in these past three meetings, the complexity of the topic is very clear, and I think at the end of the day, however the day ends up, the goal of all of us should be to do no harm, no matter where we are in this topic, and really move forward because the consumer of this is kids. And we always have to keep that in the forefront.
Absolutely. So without any further announcements or ado, let us bring up Dr. Colleen Pinnell, Assistant Professor of Literacy Elementary Reading at Carroll University. Welcome to our committee, and we will allow you to proceed when you are ready. We, as a reminder, we are on WisconsinEye, and if you would silence your smart devices, that would be good. And when you are ready to testify, there's a button that you can push that turns it green if you haven't done this before, and that will put you on audio as well as video for the millions of people that watch WisconsinEye every day. So that is a question for the gentleman who is coming past you. So.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. I know that we are all on the same page with regards to our desire to improve the literacy outcomes of children in the state of Wisconsin. So I appreciate the time that you've given me to present. It's definitely an honor and a privilege to be here. My talk today is really going to focus on teacher preparation within the state of Wisconsin, and specifically how we are adequately preparing pre-service teachers to teach reading to all children who struggle or otherwise struggle. A little bit about my background. I hold licenses as a regular education teacher, as a reading specialist, as well as a reading teacher, and I have worked in all three capacities. I've worked in a broad variety of contexts. I've worked in parochial schools and charter schools, and primarily in K-12 public education. My PhD is in language and literacy from Cardinal Stritch University, and I currently work as an assistant professor at Carroll University, where I teach pre-service teachers as well as graduate students. I co-chaired the Wisconsin Professors of Reading, which is a special interest group of the Wisconsin State Reading Association, and it's comprised of reading professors throughout the state. My research agenda has specifically focused on readers who struggle with literacy acquisition, not due to issues of decoding or fluency, but due to issues of comprehension. I'm also have also published research on classroom discourse and its relationship to reading comprehension. So I'm using several acronyms, as we love to do in education. I have given you a handout of those various acronyms. The top two are ones that I will use most frequently within this presentation. I've also provided you with a guide of specific suggestions that I'm going to touch on within today's presentation. So I'm going to begin with just a general overview of what the research suggests with regards to teacher preparation. And we know that effective teacher preparation matters. We know that when students have completed an exemplary program, they are better able to diversify their instruction, they are better able to draw from a wider repertoire of instructional strategies, and they're also better able to just transition from a college setting into an actual professional environment. We also know that it's not just content knowledge or subject knowledge that matters, but our students have to be able to have some dexterity and know how to actually teach the knowledge that they've been given. So there's a lot at play with being a teacher. Linda Darling Hammond has looked at exemplary programs throughout the United States, and Alverno's actually been one of them. And she's compared qualitatively what are the characteristics of programs that are considered effective. She's discovered, and what you'll see over and over on this slideshow, is that importance of field placements. And field placements are when our pre-service teachers are actually working in a classroom side by side with learners. So it's not just that they're sitting in a college classroom and hearing a professor speak, but they're actually in a placement working. And these are other characteristics that she's found with teacher prep. When we think specifically about literacy education and what the research suggests with literacy education, again, that whole idea of field placements you will see as being critically important for literacy education. So for example, at Carroll University where I teach, our students begin as freshmen out in classrooms. It's not that they're sitting in my classroom listening to me lecture, but they're actually working one-on-one with children, not just observing, but working with kids beginning freshman year. And then they take specific methods courses. So methods courses are when they're taught actual strategies for teaching reading, as well as the content of reading acquisition. So we know that these specific literacy programs that are effective have these qualitative features to them. That spiraled piece means that our literacy is not just a one and done course, but that literacy is the foundation of all learning. And so our students are continually coming back to understand how the brain acquires the ability to learn to read. We also have some research showing that when our pre-service teachers work with students in an intervention setting, that they report higher levels of confidence and knowledge of the teaching of reading. So, as a professor, there's a lot for me to think about when I prepare pre-service teachers. One area that I draw my knowledge on is a seminal study that looked at the qualities of emergent first grade classrooms, so emergent literacy, the qualities of quality first grade classrooms. And in this study, the researchers went into states, 5 different states throughout the country. And they went into schools and they asked principals to look at, to suggest who would be their exemplary reading teacher, first grade teacher of reading, and who was kind of your typical average teacher, not a bad teacher, but who's just your typical teacher. And then they looked at the test scores of those specific teachers and validated that the suggestions that the principal had given were indeed accurate. Then they went and they observed these exemplary teachers. So these teachers were known for, on the test scores, for improving word recognition, for improving passage comprehension, for improving vocabulary. And they looked at all of these teachers. They studied them. There were about 30 teachers that they looked at. And then they qualitatively compared these teachers and discovered that these are the traits that they all had in common. And they have this ability to engage all of their readers. They have good classroom management. They're able to provide that explicit instruction that readers and emergent readers need. They have literature-rich classrooms. They are able to provide prolonged engagement in the actual act of reading. So it's not just isolated skill instruction, but it's actual practice of reading real texts. They're able to differentiate for all of the readers within their classroom. They're looking at not just the readers who are struggling or in the middle, but the readers who are also maybe achieving at higher levels. So they're able to differentiate for all of those learners. They're able to foster a sense of self-regulation in readers, and that's the ability, as we know, young children sometimes have a harder time with self-regulation, so they're able to do that. And then they're able to connect literacy across the content areas. They're able to show how, allow children to read in social studies, read like a scientist, and look across the content areas. So that's just kind of what we know from research about what are the qualities of effective teaching in first grade. For pre-service teachers, they also need to know specific foundational knowledge. So I draw on the National Reading Panel, the 5 pillars of reading instruction. I think that's kind of our low-hanging fruit to begin with because it makes sense for pre-service teachers when they're just learning about literacy acquisition. That foundational knowledge, though, is not about teaching specific programs. It's not minimizing the complexity of those components, but really understanding them in depth. That ties to our pre-service teachers' ability to understand the different theories of reading acquisition. So reading is an incredibly wide and deep field. There are multiple theories of how we learn to read. So they're exposed and provided an overview of some of the bigger theories of reading, not just for word identification, but for fluency, but for comprehension, for motivation. So there are multiple theories of reading and literacy. Likewise, they need to understand assessment. Assessment is, again, a very broad category. Our pre-service teachers need to know how to administer phonological assessments. They need to know how to administer concepts of print assessments. They need to know how to do what formative assessments are. Those are those day-to-day assessments. Our teachers also need to know what we call them running records or analyzing a reader's oral reading. That is on the Foundations of Reading test, which I'll get to in a bit. So there are multiple assessments that our students need to know to be able to use, but also understand why they are using them. So that why is a big piece of that as well. And then what is teaching? Teaching is all about instruction. So not only do they need to have all of this knowledge of reading, but they need to know how to actually deliver it, how to enact, how to be a teacher. And that is difficult. So they need to know multiple strategies. Again, they need to have that dexterity to be able to draw on strategies for specific learners. So the NRP was a great starting point and is a great starting point for me as a professor, but the National Reading Panel ignored writing instruction. There is nothing in there about how to teach the process of writing. How do you write a literary essay? How do you write an argumentative essay? I have to teach that to pre-service teachers, the methods of teaching those specific things. There's nothing in there about classroom discourse. How do I question readers so they think critically about the text? That's also things that our pre-service teachers need to know and understand. Motivation, again, how do we motivate readers so they're engaged in what they're reading? There are many layers of being able to be an effective teacher, and I think this slide really gets at what's in that, beyond just phonics instruction or knowing what phonological awareness is. So knowing that, we don't teach in a vacuum either. That teaching is also contextual. So our pre-service teachers are put in multiple different contexts, and they need to be able to teach in different contexts. 46 million children in this country experience hunger, trauma, violence. Those children end up in classrooms. We have children who we teach whose last meal was yesterday at lunch, where they got the free lunch, and now they're coming to me in the morning and hopefully have had their free breakfast. Those are the children that we are teaching. And I need to know the social emotional aspects of learning as well. And this is research from neuroscience and developmental science about what pre-service educators and all educators in general really need to know about learning, that it's not just academic, but it is social emotional as well. And I hope that we can always keep that in mind with young children. So learning to teach is very complicated. Darlene Hammond has done a lot of research just on how do we create these effective educators? And she's problematized it in 3 different ways. So she stated that there's this problem of apprenticeship, and that means that we have to help our pre-service teachers kind of undo some of that thinking of, well, this worked for me, it should pretty much work for everyone. I was taught this way, so I'm just going to teach this way. Nope, there are kids in your class that won't learn how you were taught. So that problem of apprenticeship is something that we're continually working with pre-service teachers. The problem of enactment, how do I teach? What do I do? How do I assess? How am I actually being a teacher of children in rural contexts, in urban contexts, and in suburban contexts? Children who don't speak English, children who are hungry. So there's all sorts of difficulties with teaching. And again, the problem of complexity, that there are multiple outcomes for learners: social, emotional, academic. Which brings us to dyslexia. I've read a lot about dyslexia, starting just beginning my reading teacher experience. And to me, the more and more I read about this topic, the less clear it is to me as far as a firm definition. Dyslexia is not a useful term to me. It is a contested term, so you will have literature that will explain it at purely a phonological deficit. So at its core, dyslexia is a phonological deficit within the reader that subsumes naming speed. Then you have people like Marianne Wolf, who will say dyslexia is not just phonological, it's phonological in one area. It could be naming speed, or the most difficult dyslexic to remediate could have both a naming speed and a phonological deficit, which is that double deficit hypothesis. The Decoding Dyslexia presentation, I looked at one of their citations. They actually had a citation, and I went to investigate it, and the citation described dyslexia as children who struggle with abstract thinking or retelling, and that the remediation for that was colored overlays. So there is so much misinformation about dyslexia, and the science is not clear on it. So even Marianne Wolf's work, who I really respect, some of those studies, you will find different outcomes. You will find naming speed not being a unique contributor to dyslexia. So the construct is opaque to me. It's important that pre-service teachers have an understanding of perhaps what different perceptions of dyslexia are, but the label is less important to me than their ability to understand at the core what may go haywire in a child's road to successful reading. That's really what I need to be teaching for pre-service teachers. Again, we can kind of go into the DSM-5. That excludes dyslexia as a neurobiological condition. It's not its own standalone condition in there. One thing I really hope this committee will look into is the prevalence of dyslexia. I see it written often as a 1 in 5 prevalence, that 20% of us in this room have a neurobiological condition that causes us difficulty with learning to read. Yet, I have yet, and I've searched for the specific study where they have looked at, a wide variety of the population and discovered that 20% of us have a medical diagnosis of dyslexia. I am unable to find that. When I look at people like Marianne Wolf, Reed Lyon, they will state that it's closer to 5% of us that would be technically considered as dyslexic, the most difficult to remediate for reading. International Dyslexia Association will state it as 15 to 20%. I've seen it as high as 30% on the internet. So again, whatever legislation that you are rooting your work in, I think it behooves you to get a firm understanding of the number that you're looking at, if it's specific dyslexia that you're looking at. That debate being said, it's important, again, for our pre-service teachers to understand what reading difficulty is, what reading disability is, what goes haywire on perhaps the roadmap to successful reading. It could be phonological in nature. It could be difficulties with fluency. Regardless of what we want to call that, our teachers need to understand how to recognize it and how to teach to it. That is ultimately what is most important, and that we provide early intervention for all of the children who might be struggling within our classroom. And we're also looking not just at internal factors with reading, but what are also the external factors, poverty, homelessness, those sorts of things, trauma that children experience. So Linnea Airy has done lots of work on word recognition, and she won't bore you with the details, but has done different models of word recognition, not one model of word recognition, and she's well respected in the field of reading. And she states that the ultimate goal of instruction is to help children read words in the following ways. So decoding, analogy, and prediction, being able to use context to understand what a word is. Sight is really our ultimate goal. It refers to automaticity, not necessarily a strategy to teach reading, but we all sit and we can read with automaticity. We can read words by sight. That's the ultimate goal for reading. So really for pre-service teachers, I need to help them understand what are the different approaches to word recognition. What is synthetic phonics versus analytic phonics? How do people go about teaching those different areas of phonics? So having that knowledge base is really important for our pre-service teachers to understand. Beyond just phonics, though, there's also comprehension. What is reading comprehension? What about our kids who can read absolutely every word beautifully, fluently, but when you ask them, tell me what you read, they can't do that. They have a hard time doing that. So our pre-service teachers also need to address the needs of those children. Now, that would not be considered dyslexia. That comprehension, not due to issues of decoding or fluency, is not dyslexia. So, again, there's no silver bullet in reading. Believe me, if there was, I'd use it and I'd teach it. It's too complicated. It's complex. It's layered. There's so many influences that shape it. So there's not a program out there that I will say, this is it, use it, and everyone is going to learn to read. So when we think about graduate education and the role of our graduate students who obtain a reading teacher or reading specialist license, that's a different field, I wouldn't say a different field of study, but just a more advanced field of study. To give you an understanding, a reading teacher typically works with students before an IEP process. I think I had seen it stated at a previous presentation where a presenter had said that the child got an IEP and then the reading specialist just didn't know what to do with them. Well, that kind of is not exactly how the system is set up to work. What happens is a child will see a reading teacher for intervention and go through what we call response to intervention. If they are still not succeeding, then they will get an IEP, and then that child goes on the caseload of a special education teacher. So then it's the special education teacher and all of us really to make sure that that child learns to read successfully. So a reading specialist is involved in more of a district-wide level, coaching teachers, auditing the curriculum, really making sure that the framework of literacy is conducive to all the children in the school. So in the state of Wisconsin, we require the following for teacher preparation. We require that our students learn phonics, and they learn how to teach phonics, and there is a phonics requirement in the statutes in Wisconsin. We are also aligned to a universal design for learning, which is basically, kind of think of it like when people go bowling, you don't ever want to bowl and bowl to the middle. You want to bowl to the sides because you get all the pins. Universal design for learning is the same thing. As a teacher, you want to hit every kid in your classroom. And so you want to be able to meet the kids who might be struggling, who are advanced, who are also in the middle. So it's something that we teach really our pre-service teachers to be able to differentiate for their instruction. Teacher preparation programs, we are under a continuous review process. So every year, the Department of Public Instruction visits our school, our university, and they interview us. They look at all of our data. They look at our foundations of reading test scores. They look at year-to-year trends. They look at our EdTPA data, which is another assessment that our pre-service teachers are required. So we are audited every year by DPI to make sure that we are achieving our goals and moving forward in our programming. Each 5 years, our teacher prep program is approved by DPI. So we are under a 5-year approval. And this is shifting slightly in October, but this review process will remain, but just the nitty-gritty details of it, I think, is going to shift slightly. Beyond DPI, each college and university, so in my program, we don't just keep our data in-house. We have to report that data to our dean, to the provost, to the president of the university, to the board of directors. That data is made available, so they are well aware that we are ensuring that our pre-service teachers are passing the Foundations of Reading test and passing EdTPA, which is another assessment. The Foundations of Reading test has been in place since 2014 in the state of Wisconsin, and it is mirrored after the Massachusetts test of reading, who lead the state in, I believe, lead the nation in reading scores. It requires to be licensed in the state of Wisconsin, you have to successfully pass this exam. And it is a very difficult exam, I will say. It's not easy. There are 100 multiple choice questions and 2 essay questions on this. And it really assesses just foundational knowledge of how to teach reading, not just what is phonological awareness, but how do you actually teach phonological awareness? What does phonological awareness contribute to reading development? Why is it important? How does it differ from phonemic awareness, et cetera, et cetera? And yet, the FORT has its limitations as well. The FORT is not aligned to the Wisconsin state standards for students. So parts of it are, but when the Common Core came out, which is what the Wisconsin standards are, it shifted a little bit about what we're teaching in classrooms. So there's a big piece of writing. How to teach writing is in the Common Core, not how to teach writing, how to be a writer. Our students have to demonstrate proficiency in writing within the Wisconsin state standards. That is not on the Foundations of Reading test. Comprehension and standards in the state have shifted. That is not represented in the Foundations of Reading test. So it is not entirely aligned to what our pre-service teachers need to know. There's no feedback provided to me as a professor with the FORT. I get a score, and that's pretty much it. So for me to meaningfully use a test score is kind of difficult. 20% of that test is an essay question. And we have students who struggle with that essay question, and I'm doing my best to try to help them, but I don't have feedback on where they went wrong or why they didn't do well. So it has its limitations as far as a teacher prep program goes. We are aligned to standards throughout the national standards. So we have the in-task standards. These are the standards for the in-task standards in the state, and they are Wisconsin standards for teachers. Our pre-service teachers must present evidence of their competence within these 10 standards. They do that through the EdTPA process and through their coursework and the portfolio work that we do in-house as well. EdTPA is an assessment, if you're not familiar with it, that is done during student teaching. It's a performance-based assessment. So a pre-service teacher, they are videotaped teaching. They write lesson plans. They write a full write-up about the students that they're teaching, and they're scored on 10 rubrics, and it's scored outside of the program. So in Carroll University, they will send that videotape off to Pearson. Pearson, who we don't know, will score it and provide us with results. So we have several challenges that face our teacher prep programs. We have, recruiting a diverse teaching force that really matches the children in the classroom. Right now, it's predominantly white women who teach. And so we know that when we have more diversity in the teaching force, that student achievement is impacted positively by that. The university systems in general, we have a push to eliminate credits, the cost of tuition to maintain. So to try and get more reading classes or more reading coursework is difficult in the current system that we're in. Currently, we have expanded teacher licensing bans that will, I believe, come into play in 2019. So it's going to be K-9. You can get licensed as a K-9 teacher, or you can be licensed as a 412 teacher. Prior to that, we would have early childhood, which was birth through third grade, which will still exist. Or you would do first through eighth grade and then 6 through 12. So now what we're seeing is this broad K-9 license. So if you want to be, for example, a 4K teacher, I question whether how many people are going to want to go and get a 4K teaching license when it really, teaching, if you want to teach in a school setting, you probably are going to go for that K-9 license. So looking at some of the repercussions that are going to happen because of these new licensing laws, lifetime licenses being another one. We have now everyone will be licensed for life, no requirement for professional development or ongoing learning, which is problematic. Teacher attrition is a big problem. We have our most experienced teachers leaving the profession, 42% attrition rate in 2016, 2017. I will caveat that it does include retirements, but nevertheless, that number is still quite high. There was a survey that was on DPI's website recently, and I couldn't find it, that said that the teachers who were the most experienced were the ones who were most considering leaving the profession. We also have trouble just retaining teachers in the first 3 years. That's a high rate of departure in those first 3 years of teaching. So attrition is a big problem in this profession. Multiple reasons for that. I provided a few. I've given you some suggestions. I think that ongoing professional development is critical for educators, that we can't expect a pre-service teacher. I showed you how much they need to know when they step in on day one. It's a lot. And they need support, and they need ongoing PD from reading specialists and reading coaches, not in a program, but in the broad field of literacy. We need to support teachers with induction programs. In other states, they've had some success with teacher induction programs where they've really made an effort to support teachers outside of the district that they're working in, but just try to provide that mentoring for them is really, really important. Looking at FORT data and how we're getting feedback to use it. I mean, the FORT's great, but if it's not doing much to change my practice, it really doesn't do much, right? Fast-track teacher prep programs are creeping into Wisconsin. So looking at the repercussions of fast-track teacher prep, somebody can get a teaching license without student teaching. That's a problem. So how do we go about looking at what are the repercussions of that? Is that even necessary? Do we need fast-track teacher prep? So looking at that, and often those fast-track programs are put in urban environments. The kids who need the most and the highly qualified teachers are getting fast-track teachers. So looking at that, I think, is really important. And then the rest of that, I think I've pretty much touched on. And I will leave you with this. I hope we can really learn from NCLB and the money that was spent on the science of reading and the National Reading Panel's work. This is Margaret Spelling's statement prior to the results of NCLB, but she said, if there ever was a program that was rooted in research and science and fact, this is it. This is like the cure for cancer. And $1 billion tax dollars later, Reading First did not produce a statistically significant impact on student comprehension test scores in grades 1, 2, or 3. And I am open for questions.
Thank you, Colleen, for coming in and having the conversation with us that you did. You indicated a bit of lack of clarity or lack of good data, I should say, about dyslexia and the percentage. Is it true that there is a spectrum of dyslexia possibly, or, not unlike other autism, for instance, where there's a severity or lack thereof, and I may be choosing the terms wrong, but is that maybe one of the reasons why it's difficult to nail down a percentage?
Perhaps, but I also believe it's how we're defining it. So I think starting with the definition can help figure out what the numbers are. So if it's a lack of access to texts or a child who hasn't been provided a rich oral language home environment, is that a dyslexic child? I think that's an important question. What are we looking at? Because dyslexia, when I read about it, is neurologically based, and that it's not something that is a result of external factors.
Okay.
But if you want to say, spectrum of reading difficulty, absolutely. I think we have a spectrum of why kids struggle with reading, sure.
Okay, okay. I may have other questions, but I'll turn it over to others in the, on the committee for questions. Stephen Dykstra, go ahead, and if you would acknowledge the chair in between, I'd appreciate that.
So, you made the point that the DSM excludes dyslexia as a verifiable neurological condition. Can you say some more about that and why? Is that something that you find is that many teachers of reading and many reading professors have found to be important, that gets repeated fairly often?
No, I think my point in bringing that up is that it's confounding the definition. Like they cannot come conclusively to an agreement on what dyslexia is. So therefore, it's just, the whole term is unclear. And that was my purpose in
So
bringing
where
that
did-
up.
And Stephen, if I may, the way you actually acknowledge the chair is to ask, may I have a follow-up, and then
So
I'll,
may I?
yes,
have
you
a
may.
follow-up? So,
Yes, you may have a follow-up.
Did you get that, where did you get that information that the DSM doesn't include that?
Right on the on the APA website, I'll provide you with a citation and with the
Okay,
information. Sure.
because I just want to, if it's okay for me to say, the DSM does include dyslexia.
Not as a standalone.
No, it says that it is an alternative term to describe specific learning disability, which is
Difficulties.
well-defined.
Right, and my point is that it's not a standalone neurobiological condition. That is true. It's under the category of specific learning disorders. It's listed as a potential, and they state and their rationale for not including it is because of the lack of clarity in the literature of what defines it. And that is written in where I got that information from. So I will provide you with that.
Would you like a follow-up?
I'd like a follow-up. The whole DSM is a series of categories, each of which includes 1, 5, 10, sometimes dozens of conditions. Dyslexia is clearly listed as a term which can be used to describe specific learning disability when the problem is phonological.
Does it
And
say that when
spelling.
the problem is phonological in nature?
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
Do we have another question? We'll come back to Stephen.
Okay.
Brenda Warren?
In all of the presentations that we've been having, one of the terms that's used frequently is explicit instruction, and you referred to that also in your presentation. Can you define for me specifically what you mean by explicit instruction, and then give some examples of
Sure.
what explicit instruction would look like in a classroom and in early elementary
Sure,
reading?
absolutely. So I always explain it to my pre-service teachers that there's a difference between explicit instruction and a difference between implicit instruction. Implicit instruction would be reading a big book of rhymes, for example, and just reading it out loud, enjoying the language in the story. Implicitly, kids might be hearing those rhymes and learning what rhyme is. Explicit instruction would be showing kids, watch me as I rhyme, goat, boat, moat. I'm explicitly showing it to them. Now you try it, goat, boat. Can you produce a rhyme? So it's explicitly showing them what a rhyme is, modeling it for them, and then having them produce that rhyme. So it's very clear with what children, I can walk into a classroom and I can tell exactly what you're teaching with explicit instruction.
I have a follow-up.
Absolutely.
Can you go a little further with that? And phonics and phonemic awareness has also been a theme in what we've been talking about the last two, now this meeting too. What would explicit phonics or phonemic awareness instruction look like in a classroom?
So phonemic awareness, explicit instruction could be the use of Alconen sound boxes. So I could model for students how I take a cat, for example, and model the sounds that are in cat with sound boxes. K, eh, t. Now you try it. Push those sounds into a box. That's explicit phonemic awareness instruction.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, or? Michael Weber, go ahead.
Colleen, thank you for coming and sharing information with us. And I thought the information you shared was very accurate, on target. One question I have is you mentioned teacher induction programs. Would you please give the committee some examples of that?
Sure. At Carroll, we're starting this and trying a teacher induction program. But what it is when teachers, they graduate and they go into that first year of teaching, which is really hard, we provide kind of a space for them to come back and process through some of those experiences, some support, some mentoring. So we actually pair them with an experienced teacher as a mentor. And that person is outside of the district that they work in. Because I think when you're brand new in a place of employment, you don't necessarily want to speak up or ask questions. So an induction program allows the mentoring to take place outside of the district and promote success in that first year of teaching, or first 3 years of teaching, really.
Absolutely.
One other question or comment. You talked about teachers leaving the profession and specifically reading specialists. I assume that's what you were referring to? Or
I don't know what the statistics are on that. So that attrition rate, I think, was just holistically for teachers, yeah. So I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
Donna Hedvig?
Thank you for coming. Your presentation was very interesting. In terms of the in-task standards that are being used, are you familiar with the IDA's knowledge and practice standards? In terms of the depth of study of both of those, which one would you find to be more useful for teachers?
The IDA or the IDEA? Can you say that again?
IDA.
IDA. Well, I would say the in-task standards are broader standards and they pertain more so to all subject matter. So they're not specific to reading. The IDA standards are specific to dyslexia. There are the International Literacy Association standards. That's another set of standards that we look at as well. I would say what I do and what I do in my graduate programs is we look at both sets of standards and we compare and contrast the difference of those standards and how do they privilege certain areas of reading or certain methods of instruction. I would say the ILA standards, I think, are extremely comprehensive and excellent for both the teaching of reading as well as the specialist role and the coaching role, the newest iteration of those.
Okay, thank you. I have a second question. In Wisconsin, we use the Standard C. It's called Remedial Reading in the Law Guidance related to Standard C. And in that document, it states that we are to use scientifically based remedial reading interventions. But I was not able to get clarity on that from DPI of what that looks like. What would that look like for your school?
For me, scientifically based would mean that the remediation that you're providing to a reader who struggles is rooted in research studies of quality, and that we have, that you're providing, for example, reading recovery is an example. If you look at the What Works Clearinghouse results of reading recovery and the effects of reading recovery on first grade reading performance, it's excellent. So that is an effective first grade reading remediation because of the science behind and the research studies that support its implementation.
Thank you.
And on this committee, you'll note that there are some of us who are elected and some of us who are content specialists.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason I'm pointing that out is because this committee is specific to dyslexia. And one of the things I was going to do at some point, and I think now may be as appropriate as any, is to ask Ledge Council to read kind of the scope of what the study committee is. And then I would like your thought on, are we misguided in our in having a study committee that is this narrowly focused? And also, I may have more follow-ups, but just curious about, as an elected official, we are concerned about letters that we get from parents who say, this is our frustration with our school, and obviously sitting on this study committee, we all got a lot of those. So, if you don't mind, Legislative Council, read the scope statement and then those questions for you, if you would.
Scope statements, just by way of introduction, are created out of the requests that the Legislative Council receives in a similar process by, eliciting feedback on what we should do study committees on. So I drafted this, but
Okay.
out of the requests that we received. The study committee is directed to review current screening, identification, school intervention, and treatment protocols for dyslexia in K through 12 schools, to examine the effects of current state statutes and regulations on literacy outcomes for students with dyslexia, and to evaluate the effects of dyslexia on literacy outcomes in the state. The committee shall study recent research on evidence-based instructional techniques for students with dyslexia, determine the components and costs of successful dyslexia education practices and laws in other states, and identify institutional obstacles to academic attainment for these students. The committee shall consider legislation to implement screening for characteristics of dyslexia in early grades, to ensure that reading instruction and intervention practices incorporate relevant research findings from the University of Wisconsin, to improve the partnership between parents, educators, counselors, and others on early identification and effective interventions for dyslexic learners, and to enhance statewide access to updated resources and training on dyslexic education.
Books are always best when read by their author, so thank you, Jessica. That is a big mouthful, and I don't know how much of that you had seen before, how much of you had looked at, and if you have any input on that relative to the questions I ask. Is it too narrow? Is it too specific?
Well, I feel your big task is defining it, right? So you're either defining it as a 5% issue, which begs the question, are we going to create legislation for 5% of kids when we know that we have an achievement gap that's much greater than that, and that those children aren't all dyslexic children, right? Those children are struggling with reading for other issues beyond dyslexia. Now, if your charge is reading difficulty and how to improve reading in the state of Wisconsin, that's different, I think, than the 5% of dyslexia. I think the number that you're looking at and the definition that you're looking at is really what will be difficult for this committee to ascertain.
One of the things that we will consider after lunch and after the testimonies are given is actually doing a definition of dyslexia, as other states have done. There's some variation within those, and we have a paper in front of us talking about that. Are you suggesting that it's ill-advised to define it, that we should just be status quo and not have a definition for the 5% when other states have done? Again,
I mean, I think you could perhaps define it as 5%, but then that begs the question, are you doing legislation for 5% of kids? Or are you looking, if we're looking at literacy, there's a lot there. There's a lot that causes that achievement gap. That's not just dyslexia. And if we are really, in fact, wanting outcomes for children in the state of Wisconsin for reading to improve, we've got to look beyond 5%. That 5% is important. Believe me, I don't want to diminish that at all. I work with struggling readers as my career and absolutely want to help them. But I also want to help children that don't have access, who have other reasons as to why they might be struggling with reading, or maybe poor instruction. I mean, whatever it is, we have to make a difference to help those children.
and you indicated that there is no silver bullet, and I certainly acknowledge that, that you are an expert in the field. I am not. We heard, I think, in our first meeting that if you implement a certain, not a certain brand, but a certain method of teaching, that all students achieve more. Is that an inaccurate statement or an accurate statement in your,
I
the
would
way you would see it?
say it depends on what, again, context matters. The National Reading Panel found no difference between analytic phonics and synthetic phonics in all of the reviews of their research. There was a slight difference, not statistically significant with synthetic phonics. So children will respond to an analytic approach to phonics instruction. It doesn't have to just be Orton-Gillingham, which is a synthetic approach to instruction. We've seen success with other programs. Reading Recovery is another one. It is a different way of teaching reading. It's highly effective. Look at the What Works Clearinghouse results. That may be where you want to start. Wilson is one that's frequently mentioned, but look at What Works Clearinghouse and the results of Wilson in larger studies. They're not there. So I think look at what the research says.
Final question for me is, we saw charts here, I think, in each one of the meetings relative to ranking. You know, our reading scores haven't changed, but our ranking has.
Right.
Not in a good way. What do you attribute that to?
I think there's multiple reasons for that. This committee is not talking about reading comprehension. You are as kind of, if we fix phonics, then kids will comprehend. Well, that's not necessarily true. You have kids who will struggle with critical thinking and critical comprehension and decode just fine. The NAEP is really assessing deep critical comprehension. That's what it's getting at. So a committee that really looks at comprehension would be excellent, or if the purview of this committee were to change to really look at what is critical comprehension in the classroom, that may be something to think about. But that it isn't, again, the silver bullet. It isn't, the NAEP scores aren't because kindergarten teachers aren't teaching phonemic awareness or letter sounds. There's a lot more that goes into becoming a reader, and I think I've provided those issues today.
And as the chair, I'll allow myself a follow-up to that.
Yes.
I'm curious, how do we differ from other states with regards to that? Because we've fallen in ranking, and that says something that we are either doing something different than other states, or then the makeup of our students and or our teachers are different than other states. And somehow that doesn't stack with what I would believe to be true. So how did we slide?
I don't know entirely how we slid. I did look at the graph, where we peaked was like in the 90s, which was the whole language movement, right? And then we slid down. And not saying that whole language at all. I'm not a proponent of saying that whole language is what saved reading at all. But if we want to get into some of those games, I'm not saying that. Right? I don't know what those scores are telling us. I'm not necessarily sure that those scores are telling us about specific phonics or methods of instruction. I think they're telling us more so about the demographics, changes in rural areas and different areas, access, funding, those sorts of pieces. We've had changes in the state with education since Act 10, so that's definitely played a role in the state, in those scores, I'm sure.
And I could have multiple more follow-ups, but
Yeah,
I
I
will
know.
let you
Yeah.
off the hook at this point. Is
Yeah.
there Vice Chair Schottner?
My question really, you touched on a little bit, was the social impact on reading. Hunger, of course, is a big thing, but domestic violence, how, can you explain how that affects a child's ability to read?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of research coming out about trauma on a child's developing brain, and that young children that are exposed to trauma before the age of 3, it actually changes the trajectory of their brain. Like their brain changes because of that. It impacts their ability to learn. So children who are impacted by trauma, their needs and their development is different than just children who are not. And you're seeing in classrooms too, even at district levels, a lot more emphasis on trauma training and responding to trauma from children. But teachers now need to do that, trauma in children.
Just follow up. Can you explain how hunger affects reading?
Sure. Think of being hungry and trying to learn. It's not easy, right? I have a difficult time learning when I'm hungry. I think it's just a basic need. Hunger is a basic need. Shelter is a basic need. When your basic needs are not being met, you cannot learn. That's just how it is.
And at this point, I'm actually keeping a list. We'll go to Ann Malone first, and then Donna, and then Steve, and then Brenda. So, pardon me, and then, so yes, we've got everyone here. And I will remind you that we don't have a ton of time left for this, but if it is pertinent and relevant, I'm okay, because we don't have a full schedule this afternoon. So, Ann.
I was very interested in what you said. I'd like to clarify, though, that, oops, I should turn this on. Sorry. I'd like to clarify that, using 5% offends me, because I think dyslexia is much larger than that. So I'd rather go with the IDA statistics. Also, probably 85% of students who have an SLD in the area of reading, writing, and spelling are dyslexic. So I understand the overlap of terms. And, in autism, we work with kids one-on-one, and it's less than 1% of the population. So even if it is 5%, that's a big chunk of kids. And we don't have the scope. I mean, we are here for dyslexia, and I'm here to represent as those stakeholders, those kids and those parents. I think a problem with the fort that teacher preparation has is not so much lack of feedback on how your students failed, but what you teach. So you said you teach how the brain acquires skills to read. The in-depth knowledge that's really needed. I have a background as a speech and language therapist, and I didn't know any of this until I dove into dyslexia. I really desperately think we need to change so that teachers have an in-depth knowledge, not just a short course to pass the fort.
Which we don't. We don't have a short course to pass the fort. That's not at all. We're teaching in depth of those principles.
So what do you teach in terms of how does the brain acquire skills to read?
Well,
Hoping there was a question.
Yeah, I know
in
I was
there
getting there,
somewhere.
sorry, I'm slow. As compared to how the brain learns oral language.
yes. So we teach, first with pre-cert teachers who come in with limited, right, not a lot of knowledge of how we learn to read. So we have basic academic terms. What's a phoneme? What's a grapheme? What's the difference between, what is phonological awareness? How does it differ from phonics? So just kind of the basics is where we really start. From there, we look at specific instructional strategies to teach children how to map sounds to letters, how to segment and hear just the initial sound of a word, then how to maybe hear the ending sound of a word, hearing all three sounds within a consonant, vowel, consonant word. So it's a progression. I can't sit here and give you my whole class, but I'm offended that you're saying that it's not in depth, because you haven't stepped into my classroom or any other professor's classroom to really make such an assertion.
Well, may I have a follow-up? That's why I'm asking the question, is
Okay.
how do you teach this?
Yeah.
Because I have seen some modules that are basically just taught to pass the fort. But
But that's different.
I haven't
think
seen
we-
yours, and I don't know
Yeah.
that, and I understand. But the question was, how does the brain acquire skills versus reading skills versus oral language? Do you teach, oh, I did it again. Do you teach that? And then I'll let it go to other people, because I know I'm taking too long.
Okay, so oral language being a natural process, right? That the brain is, that we need to be taught to read, whereas language is something that is natural for children. Yeah, so again, I'll go back to my previous example. We are not born learning how to read, and that you need an effective instructor to be able to teach that process of reading. And so all of those pieces, oral language grounds that, the talking, the vocabulary that young children and infants, preschoolers, that helps to support then their ability to read, but it begins at the phonological level and at the letter level, and yes, we teach all that.
I'm curious about what you said about synthetic and analytical phonics, that there's no evidence to show that analytical phonics is more effective than synthetic. So, well, help me out here then. The systematic phonics instruction was recommended by the National...
Systematic is different than synthetic.
Okay.
Yes, so systematic means you're systematically going through
Right.
a sequence of phonics. Synthetic tends to be more of a part to whole sort of approach to instruction, so starting with word parts, moving them to the whole. Analytic phonics is more looking at specific blends, onset rhyme, looking at the word part, and then starting with the whole and then moving to the part. So it's just a different approach of instruction.
Okay, so then how do you get a system built in that?
Yeah, there is not one exact system, and the NRP will say that as well. There are generals, guidelines. Vowel sounds are typically more difficult for children than a consonant sound, right? Because vowels have two different sounds. So kind of going through a sequence that makes sense for children in stages of reading. Digraphs are more difficult than a single consonant. So
Correct.
those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you.
Steve?
I want to take an opportunity to say that one thing we agree on and we share is a deep admiration for the work of Linnea Airy, and for people in the room and on the committee who are less familiar. Linnea Airy, I think, is the acknowledged expert on explaining what can only be described as the miracle by which unfamiliar words become familiar words that your brain can read automatically without you even knowing how you do it. She's made a career out of describing that, and I certainly agree with you. Is it your impression of Linnea Airy's work, because you presented three things, decoding, analogy, and prediction, is it your impression of Linnea Airy's work that these are things that we should be teaching all these things to young readers, that she doesn't strongly favor one of those over the others, that she doesn't see one of them as more central or more essential than the others?
I don't know how to answer that question. I'd have to go, her work is complex, so I'd have to really look specifically at her phases of word learning to see what she specifically states. So I really don't want to give a faulty answer on that.
Okay. If you have a chance to stick around in the afternoon, I can promise you there's going to be a conversation about that.
Sure.
Nancy?
You had mentioned ongoing professional development for our current teaching population. What would you recommend, given especially the knowledge of the how field service practice improves teacher results?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lifetime licensure did us no favors in education. So prior to that, we were, if you were a teacher, you had to get recertified, basically. You had to show evidence that you are continuing to learn about this changing profession. We no longer have to do that. I think that's one thing I would suggest if you could. Probably can't change, but I think that is important. Making sure that schools have coaches or people who can support teachers, not only in their first year, but any sort of, in literacy in general, that they're able to provide that ongoing professional development that is ongoing. It's not just, I'm going to go to a workshop and now I'm done, but that it is sustained professional development.
May I follow up?
Yes.
The EdTap
EdTPA.
assessment that you mentioned, previously we've had funding for teachers who got nationally board certified. If there was funding for teachers who who passed that assessment as an option for ongoing professional development, do you believe that would be quality professional development for teachers of reading that are currently in the field? And what type of support do you think they would need?
To go through EdTPA? Well, are you talking about specifically with reading teachers or reading specialists, or?
Or even kindergarten through third grade teachers?
Oh, well, having them recertify through EdTPA? Is that what you're saying?
Having it as an option for ongoing professional development.
Yes, I think national board certification is very similar to EdTPA, so that is an option currently in the state of Wisconsin, that teachers can go through the national boards. It's actually quite a similar process. So sure.
So do you think that would be a positive contribution to improving literacy rates in our
Absolutely.
state?
Anything we can do to develop teachers, I think, not anything, but yeah, with, quality professional development can make a difference, yes.
And I do have one separate question. What do you believe contributed to the quote that's currently up on the screen about reading first not producing statistically significant impact on student comprehension scores?
I think reading is very complex, and I don't think that implementing a program, which is basically what Reading First did, is that it gave money to schools who implemented the 5 pillars of instruction and used specific programs that had the 5 pillars in them. So I just don't think that, I think teachers teach kids, programs don't teach kids, and that's what we're seeing with that.
Brenda, Warren?
You talked about how the limitations of 4 years and the cost of college and all of those kinds of things. So I'm curious, and I understand that. I mean, there's a tremendous amount that teachers need to know before they come to school districts. And I know that as a school board member, we're continuously providing professional development. So I know there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that teachers need. if you could step out of the restrictions of 4 years and the cost and get them through as fast as you can, what would be your ideal teacher preparation program? And would there be specific courses you would add? Would there be other things that you would add to that program, or are there things that you would replace? And I guess what I'm kind of getting at is and then if you could also kind of get to, in your mind, what are the absolute essential courses and knowledge and skills that teachers need before they graduate from your program?
Sure.
And what do you think is reasonable to expect teachers to learn after they leave college?
That's a great question. I feel one thing we could do, and we do this at Carroll, but not with all our students just because of resources and funding, is we have a residency program that's similar to like a doctor's residency program. They will student teach for an entire year instead of just the semester. So extending the length of student teaching in a quality literacy classroom or whatever it is they're going to teach, I think would be pie in the sky, wonderful if we could do that. Making sure that freshmen, when they're majoring in education, begin in field experiences right away, that those field experiences are connected to methods courses is critical. So we do connect all of our methods, our reading methods courses, to a field placement. I work with my pre-service teachers in actual classrooms. So I teach for an hour, and then we all go to a public school and we spend 2 hours in a classroom, and I work with them on methods of instruction. And I think that's important, that I'm not just sitting back and hoping that they get it. And then we come back for even more instruction and connect kind of that theory to practice back to theory, making sure that that is really solid for our pre-service teachers. As far as additional coursework, we have a dual certification program at Carroll. So a lot of our teachers get a special ed certification as well as a regular ed certification. And the coursework for special ed includes like a speech and language class or a linguistics course. I think that would be very helpful to put in to all of our students and make available. I always appreciate it when my students have that speech language class because it does kind of up their level of literacy understanding. And I had something else I was going to say and I forgot, but it might come back to me. But yeah, I think all of those changes would be important.
Final question, Michael?
Colleen, this question is directly related to the mission of this committee. And I just want you to know, in asking the question, I came on this committee with an extremely open mind about where we're going, what we should do. It's somewhat still open.
Right.
My question is this: if the legislature was to develop legislation in regard to dyslexia, and the Department of Public Instruction was to promulgate rules for dyslexia, could something like that stand alongside of present legislation in regard to reading instruction, RTI, PBIS, and all of those
That's
other?
a great question. I think it depends on how far you go. Teachers that I talk to are overwhelmed. I mean, you've got a ton going on right now in schools. And I kind of feel like enough is enough. Let's start working with what we've got and get it better. But more mandates, more tests, more screeners, in the long run, is that really going to make a difference? I question that. I think we've seen this happen. That there's just more, and not necessary that that is working. So I don't know where you're going to fit things in such a crowded curriculum right now. I think you definitely can provide more support for parents. I think that is legitimate, that parents do need support and they need resources and they need to know where to go to talk to the schools, to get additional support if needed for their children who struggle and understand reading.
Thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it, and thanks for sticking around a little bit longer than we expected. But So, thank you.
Thank you.
And next up, we have Kathy Champeau and Deb Zarling, and I believe possibly someone else is coming up as well. So go right ahead and settle in. Thank you for joining us again, and look forward to, as I indicated to you, Kathy, on the phone, a relatively brief 10 to 15 minutes of this is what your organization can live with and can live without, and that, I guess, is enough of an introduction. So, and then for the committee as well as those watching on WisconsinEye, we intend to have a member of WSRA kind of be involved in our discussion this afternoon as invited speakers. It's our prerogative to do that. They will not have a vote on the committee, but as we had stated, they're not committee members as such, but certainly value the input from these professionals. So that is why you're here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I am going to try to stay within the 10 or 15 minutes, and I think maybe I should have a little course in auctioneer language to keep it moving, but we really do appreciate, WSRA appreciates the opportunity. Sorry. Okay. WSRA would like to thank both Representative Culp and Senator Schachner for the opportunity to provide input on this topic. And with me here, and I'll introduce them, going down from my right is Deborah Cromer, who is president of Wisconsin State Reading Association. You do know Deb Zarling, and of course, Colleen Pinnell is also part of our professional organization. She is in our presidential cycle. It's important to note that while we represent different perspectives, we all agree and we're all passionate about this topic. I don't think there's one of us in this room that doesn't want to see children being successful as readers. And so that is, we all share that passion, which is really a very powerful thing. I personally have spent over 40 years of my life passionate about this topic, working with struggling readers, and sometimes my family wishes I would be less passionate about it. And I think together we can work together to accomplish important outcomes. And that's the spirit with which we come today, is wanting to collaborate together. We are a professional organization of over 2,500 members that includes classroom teachers, reading specialists, reading teachers, special education teachers, professors, librarians, administrators. And our major goal is to help all Wisconsin students acquire a high degree of literacy, and so they can live productive lives, so they can pursue college goals, career goals, they can participate in our democracy, they can have overall well-being. That's our goal. We believe that one of the most critical factors to accomplish this is teacher expertise, and research supports that. It is the decision-making of teachers in the classroom. It is responsive teaching that makes the difference. Having high quality, not just licensed teachers in front of all of our students, no matter where they live, is essential. And our belief is based on our collective knowledge, research, and experience. That includes, like I said, expertise matters, research grounds us, literacy is a complex, not a simple process, as Dr. Pinnell laid out for you today, and it requires a comprehensive approach. So, one more caveat about our organization is we are an organization for professional learning. And most recently, in fact, just this past weekend, was one of our meetings in La Crosse, and our 300 leaders were focused on learning about the dyslexia debate. It is comprehensive. It is a vast topic. And so the foreword to this book was written by Dr. Frank Valentino, who is professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany, who is Dr. Scanlon's research partner. And you heard from Dr. Scanlon last time on reading disabilities. So having that background, what I'm going to do is go through the the memo that was given to the study committee on recommendations. So what I will do is I will go in order to share our thoughts, our opinions, and why. And also, there will be a few recommendations that may not be in the purview of the study committee, but are important to consider. And Dr. Pennell touched upon some of those as well. The first is the guidebook for parents and educators. And we totally support the development of a guidebook to help parents understand these complexities of the reading issues that their children face, and also to understand resources that are available and what they need to know to advocate for their child. And some parents have not had positive experiences in schools. And so having a handbook like this, we think, would serve a very useful purpose. It is evident that parents of children who have been identified as dyslexic feel uninformed and at a loss to understand what they need to know to be active partners in their children's education. So we believe a guide would serve that purpose, and we would also like to, if this is one of the topics that you're going to pursue, one of the projects, we would like to be partners in the development of this project. The next one is the dyslexia specialist at DPI. This position may very well duplicate positions already in place at DPI under the Division for Learning Support. DPI has a significant number of special education staffing positions, including a special education literacy consultant, under which dyslexia would be addressed, a learning disability specialist, a director of special education, and 4 assistant directors of special education, a school improvement initiative consultants for response to intervention, a parent involvement consultant, and an early childhood data consultant. And DPI also has a regular education literacy consultant who is a reading specialist with substantial training and expertise. So our question is, what is the difference between a dyslexia specialist and these positions already named? What training is needed that is different from these consultants? Is there a specific vendor that would be endorsed for this training? What is the role of the dyslexia specialist that would not be addressed by these positions? And then our other question is, would other specific positions be needed as well? For example, would there be a need for an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder consultant when the American Psychiatric Association reports it's one of the most common mental disorders affecting children? So those are our questions that we have regarding that part of your agenda. See, the next one is defining the term dyslexia. In reviewing the research, and you heard Dr. Pennell speak to that this morning, you also heard Deb Zarling speak to that in August. So in reviewing the literature and the research surrounding the construct of dyslexia and reading disabilities, it is evident that there are multiple definitions and descriptions of dyslexia. And as Elliott and Grigorenko in the book The Dyslexia Debate make clear, this is a quote, they said, "It is difficult because the field has been unable to produce a universally accepted definition that is not imprecise, amorphous, or difficult to operationalize." For example, the National Institute for Child Health and Development does not distinguish between the terms dyslexia and reading disability. The American Psychiatric Association, which produces the mental health manual for the United States and the world, called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, which was discussed briefly earlier, and this is a quote, concluded that the many definitions of dyslexia would not be useful as disorder term or in the diagnostic criteria. So our question is, how will this committee determine which dyslexia definition they would privilege when the field is still debating it? And how do you get an accurate definition of students with dyslexia that won't identify children who are not? Parents are concerned about that as well. Literacy screening assessments. WSRA supports the current legislation, which has been modified twice as a literacy screening requirement and which currently provides flexibility for districts in the choice of screening tools. On the Read to Lead Task Force, we had mandated one screening instrument, and school districts were very concerned and upset because they already had a process that was working for them. School districts have the choice of the screening tool they wish to use. Also, at that time, Dr. Donna Scanlon had written a letter about screening instruments that are used in her research study to talk about the limitations and the reasons why in their research study they use particular screeners. E are school district reports on reading curriculum and instruction. Our position is there are easily accessible information related to the reading curriculum and intervention tools of individual school districts, and they are readily available to the community and parents. And school boards actually oversee this issue. And under that heading, monitoring struggling readers, WSRA recommends that DPI make sure that school administrators, including superintendents, curriculum and instruction personnel, and principals are aware of the DPI rule regarding the need for licensed reading teachers and providing instruction to struggling readers. With our membership, we have come to realize that school districts do not even know such a law exists, as well as the need for a district reading specialist. Not all, but some districts are not even aware of that rule. In addition, they need to be aware that the identification and diagnosis of reading deficiencies in schools can be performed only by a reading specialist or a licensed professional who earned at least 6 semester credits in courses dealing with the measurement of reading skills and achievement in the diagnosis of reading difficulties. We know that there is much confusion in the field and in school districts about these rules and the current legislation. So we are asking that they be made available and aware with the people in charge of school districts. F is summer school and extended day programs to provide time for reading interventions. We totally support this initiative. There is convincing evidence that summer slide in reading is a reality. So supporting summer school programming would help alleviate this. However, what we recommend is no particular summer school program should be privileged when there are examples of a number of successful programs. So yes, as Dr. Pinnell addressed this morning, what we need to teach and what children need to know and be able to do is complex and vast, and so this would help to support those learners. G is something that we are so excited about, and we have been working as an organization to support, and that is early learning initiatives for spoken language exposure. We support early learning initiatives for developing oral language because quality learning, early learning opportunities for young children are productive and usually pay dividends. And developing oral language is key to children's literacy success across grade levels. You get a lot outcome for that type of initiative. WSRA supports investigating engaging programs that have the potential for developing oral language. And it should be noted that I know in the document, Jumpstart was the program that was referenced, and recently Massachusetts just appropriated $100,000 for the program. And so studying that program, not necessarily endorsing it, but further study, we would support. And we would also like to highlight that we, WSRA, have developed 2 DVDs for families of young children, one focusing on the development of oral language, and the other in the importance of reading to the children. Both are free and available on our website, and they're also available in 3 languages. And that we would like perhaps the study committee, perhaps if there's a parent manual, perhaps those opportunities could be made available to families in the state as well. Funding for Read to Lead grants, we support appropriating resources for the Read to Lead Development Fund, just plain and simple. Funding for reading specialists under current. Now, this is something that we have long wanted to happen in the state. As you know, I mentioned before that many districts don't even know about the reading teacher rule, and some are not even aware of the district reading specialist. But just having, they do report out, districts do need to report out if they have a reading specialist, but many times it's individuals that do not work in that capacity in school districts. So WSRA supports funding for reading specialists. We know that literacy is a complex process, as Colleen showed us this morning, and without a knowledgeable district reading specialist who's given the time to do the job that this role demands, we cannot expect to see an uptake in reading scores and movement in closing our achievement gap. A district reading specialist knows how to support teachers and provide professional development that meets the diverse needs of teachers and administrators and students. Which brings me to the teacher training licensing requirements. As I stated earlier, our mission is developing teacher expertise. We're a volunteer organization that in our spare time try to support as best we can the needs of continuous professional learning, collaborative professionalism, and we recognize the critical need for teachers to continue to grow professionally, and even more so now in light of lifetime licenses to meet the diverse needs of their students. And WSRA supports revisiting. Now, this is what I said in the beginning, that this is not necessarily under the purview of the study committee, but we do support revisiting the current changes in licensure. Just like other professions and trades in the state, continued learning is essential. And I know, Representative Culp, you're a roofer, correct? And I went on the website, and actually I went to your National Roofing Association, which is, I mean, I didn't know there was so much about roofing. All I know is when I have to have my house re-roofed.
One of the oldest trade associations in the country.
It is, and it's quite impressive. But I also know in the state that you are required to have 12 continuing education hours every 2 years, which is more than what teachers in our state are required to do. Also, if we take a look and if we listen to Dr. Donna Scanlon, and if we do research in other states, we know that teachers, in order to continue their license, need to have a master's degree. There are other states that do that as well. And we can also learn from other countries because, for example, Finland, who outperforms the United States in literacy on the PISA, requires a master's degree for those teaching literacy in the early grades. It is the most highly specialized area for licensure in Finland. So we would like to see a change also in the expanded licensing that allows teachers from K through 9 to have the same license. You heard from Dr. Pinnell all the things that a teacher needs to know and be able to do. Teaching early literacy is a specialty. It is an area that really demands a lot of knowledge. So having a licensure K-9 does not help that specialty. There's not enough time in a 4-year degree program to equip teachers with the knowledge and capacity to teach early literacy well under such a new expansive license, and we are concerned about that. We also recommend student teaching to be required as a necessary component for those pursuing alternative pathways for teacher licensure. Currently, that is not necessarily something alternative pathway teachers in that program need to do. Not requiring student teaching is analogous to allowing a doctor to simply complete medical school without residency and interning. The requirement of the Foundations of Reading test, we support the FORT for all applicants, including those seeking alternative pathways for licensure. There are loopholes to that test, and also for out-of-state teachers, unless they have successfully completed comparable exam in the state where they receive licensure. We are concerned about this because in rural areas and in urban areas where probably this type of a licensure would be, you probably would see more teachers with this kind of licensure in high-need schools. They would be those that would not have necessarily passed the FORT, which is foundational skills. In addition, WSRA recommends that the study committee, we've heard frequently reporting about the NAEP, and Dr. Pinnell just talked about that. And we are compared against other states. It's concerned that we have flat lines, so to speak, in Wisconsin, and we're trying to find answers to that. The results of this exam, are a comparison with other states, and the claim is often made that the results of this exam prove that our students need more instruction in foundational skills. And this is a misunderstanding of what this test measures. This exam is a critical comprehension test. WSRA would be willing to bring in a researcher who has spent 25 years on the NAEP board to help us understand the implications of the result of this test, including what scoring basic means and what scoring both proficient and advanced mean. Basic proficiency on this test shows a lack of the ability to engage in critical comprehension, not an inability to decode the text. So those currently are, in going through your document and your agenda, and what your goal is the things that we would support, the things that we're concerned about, and the questions that we have regarding some of the agenda items.
Well, thank you very much. And then I indicated that we would be having members of the committee go around and take 5 minutes maximum to just kind of give what you want to see, because now we're starting the dialogue part of, dialogue and discussion part of our process here. We won't be able to get to everyone if everyone takes 5 minutes before lunch, but that's okay. I think it makes more sense to kind of get a flavor for what we're doing. And I think what I will do, because it just makes sense, is to start with Ann and move in this direction. So Ann, if you are ready, that's cool. If you are not, we can come back to you. And if you want to yield up, some or all of your time, certainly do that. And I'm going to be stepping out for just a very, very short break. That doesn't mean I'm disinterested in any particular person's what they have to say, simply need to do that. So, Ann, if you're ready, go ahead.
Are you asking for the one thing we think should happen? Because I can't do one.
And that is really, no, not just one, just
Okay.
what you really want to see us come out of here. And, we have the document from Ledge Council
Right.
with many ideas on it. They're not maybe all of the ideas that we might have. You may have a brand-new idea that we haven't discussed, and we've got Legislative Council here taking good notes. So we will document those, and then later on this afternoon, we'll have more of a robust discussion with regards to back and forth. No, I can't live with that idea that Ann has, or wow, that idea that Ann had was phenomenal, let's move that ahead, type of thing. So basically, just kind of your hierarchy of what you would want to see this committee be done, and those are instructions to the rest of you as well, so.
All right, thank you. Well, I'll go ahead. First of all, thank you very much for coming in, and I'm sorry I sounded adversarial. I get upset about the numbers. I want that group served.
And just for the record, this is, you certainly may address anyone here.
No, I just
but
wanted to make sure that we were
yeah,
clear, because I want to have it,
understood.
I've got the mic on. So I would like to see a definition of dyslexia. I support the IDA definition, a guidebook for parents and teachers on dyslexia. I'm really glad to hear you support that. And maintaining the fort, because I still believe that I don't want to see teachers have to pass tests or jump through hoops. I was one. I used to say, I can test students, but I can't test and teach. It's like, you're asking so much of us. I agree, I understand. I walked that walk. I quit after 13 years. But I still think that unless administrators and teachers know what they don't know, because I do think there's a body out there of knowledge that we teachers don't know. I didn't know it. I think it's absolutely essential that our teachers do learn. You can't have comprehension if you can't decode the words. I don't want to stop at decoding. I want to keep moving forward. But that's why I maintain the fort, is that it's so important for beginning teachers, that Scarborough's rope, to get those three pieces in place before we move on. I don't want to bore kids half to death. Maybe kids who already can do those three parts of the basics of the rope can do supplemental things or other things. I support professional development. I'm appalled by ESSA and the rollback of lifetime licensure and not having professional development. Professional development both, though, for teachers who are out there teaching, as well as at the college level. Really needs to have robust structured literacy taught to education. And I'd like to see a combination of, you know, the science is out there. It's often in the school of psychology or neuropsych, and then there's teacher preparation. I wish that, you know, we could shake hands, and I agree completely. I mean, I don't know how you found so many mentors. I think that's fabulous. I really do, because mentoring is so important. But I also think the science needs to come into the School of Education more strongly. So I guess I've expounded on definition of dyslexia, guidebook, maintaining the fort, and professional development for teachers who are out there and also at the college level for new teachers. Thank you.
Amanda? Oh, sorry.
Well, I think there's several good things to think about in here. I think the top two that I'm interested in are definitely looking at some of the licensure issues around either the fast track options or the lifetime licensure. Also, the guidebook, I think, potentially could be a great resource. I do think we need to look at doing it right, making sure we have the right people at the table to do that. But if it's done right, I think that could be a good option.
I too am very interested in the guidebook, and I do think that the process is most important to ensuring a result that would be supported and implemented. Given how complex the education system is and the learning to read is, with the other topics, I'm interested in how we can support schools in improving their ability to use their MTSS systems to support all struggling readers, and potentially in that process, teasing out the difference between struggling readers, dyslexic readers, and readers with a specific learning disability. Because teasing those three out in the end is what will allow our systems to support all of them and increase literacy. And so I think we have the structures in place. It's how do we improve the use of those structures to support literacy of all of our students.
Okay, I'm looking at a guidebook for states that's guided by state statute or administrative code instead of just a plain guidebook of information. I think it needs to have some law behind it. Teacher training is so critical in this process, not only for current teachers, existing teachers. I think, you know, as you said that earlier, that we were in the whole language camp for the 90s. Well, there's a whole lot of teachers still out there that have that belief system that this is how I teach, and so we need to update their training. And the science of reading, even though it's over 40 years old, for some reason is having a slow growth here and needs to really be taught. I really am impressed with your instruction. If it's true what you say, I mean, that's what needs to happen. That's not what's happening in all schools. A dyslexia specialist at the state level is critical. Dyslexia specialists are highly trained. They take years and years of training to get through their programming. I'm not seeing that, and that's my personal experience with my training, which I'll talk more about this afternoon, but it just isn't there in Wisconsin. And finally, the fort needs to be absolutely required for all teachers. No passes, no do-overs. It needs to be required. It's an excellent test that weeds out those who have it and those who don't. Thank you.
So my top three, first is the guidebook. I think the guidebook is something that parents need. As a mother of 6 kids, I needed all the guidance I could have. And, I look back on the journey of education, and it can be very intimidating. So I think parents are eager for information, and because it just is really stressful. So guidebook is important to me. I am very intrigued by the summer school program. I think when we talk about kids and trauma and all that goes on with the process of learning, for a lot of kids, summer school is it's a big deal, and they're continuing to learn, and having a literacy program in summer school for students, I think, would have some really positive outcomes marketed the right way. And then I'm also interested in looking into the fast track and professional development. Fast tracking, I'm not real familiar with that, but I would like to know a little bit more about how that process works. And if you can fast track to a license to teach and you've never been around kids, that's a little scary to me. So that's my opinion.
And I'm just here to direct traffic, so we'll let Dr. Warren go next.
So I agree with a lot of what's already been said. One thing about the guidebook that concerns me, if that's the only thing that we were to do, is that if we have a guidebook that explains to parents what dyslexia is, how to advocate, how to get help for their student, and then we have no help for them, then I'm not sure we've accomplished what we need to accomplish. And what I mean by no help is that I think that, going back to somebody's comment, Ann's comment about making sure that we ensure that our teachers that are teaching our children know what they need to know regarding the science of reading, so that they're teaching effectively, so that all of our students can read. And I think partly the beauty of what we do is that, regardless of what the prevalence of dyslexia is good teaching, and all kids need the same foundations of reading instruction. It's just that the kids that are struggling need more, and the kids with dyslexia need even more than that. And so I think I just want to bring that out so that we aren't hamstringing ourselves, saying we're only working with whatever percent it is. And I agree, it's all over the map in terms of what people think the prevalence is. In the end, if we do this right for kids with dyslexia, we will also be helping all other struggling readers. The other thing I think, too, is important, and this kind of goes, either is in the guidebook or somewhere else, but I think making sure that we're all talking about the same thing when we say certain phrases. So I asked you about what, your use of explicit. That's, a lot of people use that phrase because it was in the NRP report, and I think a lot of people are using it a little bit differently from each other, and the same goes with scientifically based reading research and reading instruction. I think that when Dr. Seidenberg was here, he talked about, that the research isn't to tell you how to teach, the research is to tell you how the brain learns how to read. And so based upon how the brain learns how to read and what skills the brain needs, that's what the teaching should be based upon. And then, sorry, one more. And I do agree that there's not a silver bullet for instruction, but I also think that kids. So I think it's you mentioned kids fix phonics and kids will comprehend. That's sort of a sense of that's out there to some degree. And I agree that's not the case. There's a lot to comprehension. There's a lot that needs to go into teaching comprehension. But I do think that without phonics, kids won't comprehend. I mean, I think that's a necessary skill set for kids to have. It's based on, and I know Steve mentioned Ari's work. Her work is very much about orthographic mapping. That requires proficient skills in phonemic awareness and phonics. And I Anyway, I'll stop talking.
Oh, no, my clearing of throat wasn't because we were out of time.
I'll just,
It was because I needed to clear my throat.
yeah, music on the side, 30 seconds. No, I'll save the rest of what I might say for this afternoon, thanks.
I go over.
Thank you. There's obviously has been some concern from constituents about this concept or idea or term called dyslexia. I'd really be interested in what types and what kinds of emails and communications that legislatures have been receiving and what the frustrations are. I think it's difficult for us as a group to respond to some concerns if we're not fully aware of what those are. One of our speakers said that they approached a school, and they didn't name the school district, which is probably a good idea, and said that their child had dyslexia, and the school said, "We don't use that term." Well, we've had parents come to us and say, "Well, our child has dyslexia." And what we do is say, "Well, how do you know that?" Well, because we had them tested, and the pediatrician said, "Well, I'll tell you what, bring the information in that you have. We'll work with our screening instruments. We'll work with you, figure out what the child's needs are, where they're breaking down, and then we'll develop a program to address those needs." So from my standpoint, it's more about where the child's breaking down in the area of literacy and what we can do about correcting that. Now, if that means we've got to have a legislation on dyslexia going right along with whatever is already out there, which is very good, well, then so be it. But I think we have to respond to the constituents. We also have to make sure that we don't we do not overwhelm a dedicated reading specialist teaching staff that we have in this state. I mean, we have 5 reading specialists that are under direct supervision of our curriculum and instruction, who also has a reading specialist, and they work extremely hard. They use a battery of assessments to find out where kids are at and why they're breaking down. After the screener, they have an idea then, okay, what's going on? So then they have other assessments that'll break that down more so they can provide service to the kids. And in my mind, that's what it's all about, is where are the kids breaking down? What can we do? How do we assist them? How do we get, and in some ways, it's compensation. It's not necessarily curing, but it's compensation. And there are, I received 3 emails one from a district attorney and one from a legislator and one other one from a parent, and say, "I'm really glad you're on this committee because I had dyslexia and I have figured out how to compensate for it." Wow, was that interesting? So my issue is, what are the needs? How do we address the needs, and how can we support them? And one last thing in regard to professional development, I think that's absolutely critical for teachers, is professional development. And every school district has a different system for that, and ours is required of all teachers. It's comprehensive, and that's the kind of thing. And the reading specialists, well, they were just at your conference, and you guys know them really well. Those are great people because they continue to learn and grow. So I'll stop. That was 4.5 minutes, okay?
You were timing, I wasn't, but.
Yeah, I was. It said 5 minutes, so.
Yeah, excellent,
You know,
Stephen.
actually, no, I won't. Actually, some person that can save more in 5 minutes than most people say in 30.
A 5-minute speech takes a lot more work than a
It sure
30-minute
does,
one, there's no
yes.
doubt about it.
I got my notes right there.
Stephen, go
Thanks.
ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm going to surprise everybody and try to break his record. So I think we need a guidebook, but only if it's done well. I think we need to borrow heavily from places that have done it well. I think one of the mistakes we've made in Wisconsin a number of times in education is thinking that we always have to start from scratch on various standards and other things. One of the advantages of being late to the party is the music is already started when you get there. You don't have to create that for yourself. Along those same lines, I think we desperately need meaningful content standards for the IHEs, for the Institutes of Higher Education, not just in reading and literacy, but in other areas as well. But we're focused on reading and literacy. I encourage us after the break to take a look at one particular line in our specific charge for this committee. I think we are charged more broadly than just those 5%. I think it's critically important, as a number of people have said, that we fix issues around licensure in the Ford. I think it's enormously insulting to teachers to suggest that you can show up, get a license, the license lasts your whole lifetime, and you don't have to do any continuing education. People see that as a convenience to teachers. I see it as just an overwhelming insult to the field as a whole. That's not how we treat professionals. It's not how we think about professionals. I want this whole thing that we're doing now to not end. I want it to be an ongoing process. I want it to involve a diverse group of people, because I think that contributes to what the guidebook needs to do too, which is both to inform people and to dispel myths that I think we've uncovered some here. I think, unlike some people, I think screening does need to be universal. I know there's a lot of upset about the number of tests that are given in districts. Most of the tests that are given in districts are redundant. Most of them are mandated by the districts, not by the state. That goes to one of my other points, is we need to help and encourage, the state and DPI needs to do whatever they can and to help and encourage schools to get things off their plate that just don't belong there anymore, that are redundant, that are taking up time and taking up space. I sit in a number of committees with people, and the worst term that I hear when we talk about any problem with kids, something referred to in policymaking is tools for schools. Whatever's wrong with the kid, let's give some tools to the schools and let them fix it. So schools now and I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but schools monitor immunizations for us. You know, schools do everything for us, and it detracts from their ability to do what they essentially need to do. And I think that we've done too much of that. I think we need and this goes back to the early literacy stuff, we need a massive, just unending, and it can't stop when school starts. We need a massive reconstruction of how kids develop and learn vocabulary. And I think we do need to cope as a committee with this notion of dyslexia versus reading. That we're not just, you can't just talk about dyslexia. You just can't. You can't talk about dyslexia effectively without talking about reading and all reading instruction and how reading goes on. A certain percentage of the kids who struggle are simply the lower end of the tail. And, every kid with dyslexia gets most of their reading instruction in the general curriculum. So if we're not going to look at that, then we're not going to look at anything. That's it.
Well, thank you. Well, we're coming up on lunch, and I think we will take that and be back here at 1 p.m. But the instructions that I would have for you committee members is, and I think the direction that Vice Chair Schottner and I believe is good, is to dig into, I think there was almost universal support for doing something with a guidebook. Okay, now we have to figure out what that looks like, what it should include. Do we steal it from somebody else? Do we develop it from whole cloth? Be prepared for a dialogue regarding that to begin with, and because that was a kind of the more universally agreed upon first thing, we'll do the easy thing first. We'll learn how to dialogue and communicate back and forth, and give directions to Ledge Council for drafting instructions on that. And then we'll move down the list and continue that dialogue. So that is all that I have, and I appreciate you joining us for the morning, and we'll be back at 1 p.m. Thank you.